You gonna pay for that?
Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, a 2025 part of the Twisted Childverse or Poohverse movie universe, developed by Scott Chambers, who directed and wrote this, aka Scott Jeffrey, a prolific B-movie producer here in the UK. This is the official third entry into that shared universe, a little bit higher budget than the regular Jagged Edge, the production company's normal output. What's the story? Well, it focuses on Peter Pan, who in this alternate version is a child abductor and killer, a twisted individual with a scarred face who's very much kind of doing his version of Heath Ledger's Joker, I would suggest. He, along with Tinkerbell, now reimagined as an abused transgender woman with a drug problem, are abducting children, murdering them, and, air quotes, sending them to Neverland. Basically killing them, sending them on to the kind of the next life with the dream of paradise. They end up kind of running afoul of Wendy and Michael, now reimagined as kind of modern teens and stuff, who, once Michael is kidnapped, Wendy decides that she is going to try and take it upon herself to track Peter Pan down and try and free her brother. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about what works in this movie's favour. So as I've mentioned, these Poohverse movies are higher budget than your regular B-movie fare, particularly from Jagged Edge Productions and those type of production houses. And as such, the production value here is stronger. Just the sort of the level of set design, you know, just the general equipment used. It's all a little bit higher quality than your kind of regular fare that these companies put out, and you can tell that a little bit more time has been taken here. One thing that struck me about this movie is the level of seriousness and dark kind of themes that this film has. It really is quite a gruesome and even somewhat depressing film in some ways. Now, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but it's certainly, they take this subject matter very seriously. And if you kind of almost take the Peter Pan aspect out of it, this is a very twisted child serial killer that is being kind of shown here, with some very sort of gruesome kills, not just of children, but a very twisted individual, you might say, hence the twisted universe, I guess. And it's pretty strong stuff and very kind of sobering in some ways, particularly when I think in the modern age there's a lot of concern about, you know, the safety of children these days, and so that having this kind of like serial killer targeting them, you know, it is somewhat sort of disturbing, and they really don't hold back. I have to say, this movie does have some gruesome scenes and almost quite brutal scenes of violence. Maybe even you could call them action scenes. For example, the final confrontation between Wendy and Peter Pan is a dragged out brawl, knockout, smackdown. I think it's one of the most, you know, longest kind of fight scenes between a protagonist and antagonist in a horror movie that I ever remembered seeing it, because it's just like, and it's a real like down and dirty fight, I have to say. Pretty good, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It was a good sequence. I think the performances are a little mixed, but I will say I think they probably err mostly on the positive side. I do think there is some interesting performances here. The guy who plays Peter Pan, he is kind of like, as I say, using the Heath Ledger Joker as inspiration, I feel. So it does feel a little bit derivative of that, admittedly, but it's not a bad performance, and he does come across as deranged, and you know, you're never quite sure if he believes what he's saying. And I don't know if this was meant to be, but he's going on about sending kids to Neverland as if he's doing them a favour, and you're never quite sure if that's just an excuse that he's using or if he actually kind of believes that. So I'll come on to that again, but I did think it gave this killer, you know, a muddy sort of sense of what he's kind of doing, and does he believe this? Is he just this kind of messed up? That's what he believes, or is it merely just an excuse to rack up a body count? There's a couple of other characters as well that I think do a pretty good job here. Tinkerbell as well, interesting take on the character, and I gotta say I think the performance was quite sympathetic. And you know, I actually could have quite liked that character in a way. Very different from obviously the original kind of, you know, tale here. So there are some kind of interesting performances, and although I think the performances arguably are a little on the mixed side, I don't think no one here does a bad job necessarily. There's a few hokier kind of performances, but they're okay in the grand scheme of things. I think that, you know, it's relatively positive than negative in regards to the kind of the performances. VFX wise, I think it's pretty strong. As I say, there's a good use of practical kind of VFX and gore, and this Peter Pan's got this kind of scarred up face that looks kind of quite gnarly, so I kind of quite like that. And I have to say that the story did start to grip me about halfway through. I was quite sort of engrossed in the movie and intrigued to see where it was kind of going. It took me a little while to get there, admittedly, but you know, once it kind of gets going, I have to say I found the movie to be quite enjoyable in a kind of as you can enjoy obviously these kind of horrific kind of scenes and stuff. But the story was intriguing, and you know, I actually thought it was relatively kind of well put together. What doesn't work, I'm going to go with a nitpicky thing first. Now, I say this because this to me informs the story, and possibly a way that could have improved it, if you ask me. So, does the Peter Pan story exist in this world? Now, at the beginning of the movie, you see the character of our Peter Pan reading a child this Peter Pan story from a book. It is a printed book. It looks kind of old and gnarly, but it's not like a handwritten book that he has written. So that suggests to me that the story of Peter Pan exists in this universe. And as such, we do have to extrapolate that and think, okay, so if that original story exists, do adaptations exist like the Robin Williams Hook or Dustin Hoffman's Hook, the Disney films, all things like this. Okay, so if the story exists, does that mean, how does that incorporate, are these the actual characters, or are these just, it just happenstance that these kind of characters have the same names? Peter Pan, Tinkerbell, Wendy, exactly, for example. Because I wasn't quite sure, because it does appear that, as I say, in this universe, Peter Pan is a pre-existing property, in which case, but then why does no one acknowledge that? It would have, to be honest with you, it would have been beneficial to me, at least, or I think the story, to almost like have this story not exist at all, not have this kind of book at the beginning, and have either these literal people be the actual characters. This is Peter Pan in this universe, or he's a killer inspired by Peter Pan, and then you have people in the movie actually comment on that. At the moment, I feel it's this weird middle ground where it kind of wants to have the best of both worlds, where it's the Peter Pan story exists, but no one kind of acknowledges it, but everyone just happens to be called the same names and stuff. It struck me as a little weird, and as I say, I think the actual story here and the movie that we've gotten is an interesting film about a child serial killer. I actually think, in a way, the Peter Pan name distracts from it a little bit, because this movie is not a fun movie. It's not a kind of a jovial movie anyway. I feel this movie could have been taken a little more seriously if it hadn't had any ties to Peter Pan, and maybe it was just someone who was inspired by Peter Pan, and you know, people are commenting on the movie. That would have maybe made this movie a little kind of more realistic and grounded, to be honest. So you know, that's kind of my thoughts on that, and it just informs the movie, because that question was always hanging over this film. I do think going on to some other critiques, the movie I think takes a little bit of time to get going. When we have all the kind of the family drama with Wendy after her brother gets kidnapped and things like that, and their friends at work, they were, to be honest with you, the weaker performances for me. And as such, it's a little bit of a chore to get through those kind of sequences. Like I said, they're not necessarily horrible, but I just didn't think they were particularly strong, and it kind of falls back into the old, lower budget kind of quickly produced B movies that we've seen from Jagged Edge Productions and things like that. But as I say, I think once we kind of get past those sequences, I think the movie's dramatic chops kind of kick in a little bit more. Now, I've kind of touched on it. This movie is joyless and quite depressing. Having a movie based on a now royalty-free public domain property, which is traditionally a kid's property, I don't know if a dour, very depressing take on it is not necessarily what people would want from a horror version of this. I mean, it's just me. I mean, I would have thought you would have had some moments here where it's more referencing the source material. Like here, like Neverland is just a kind of a metaphor for dying, you know, for people passing on to the next life. You know, the Peter Pan's hideout is a dilapidated drug den. Some of the kind of as I say, the characters that we get a couple of other characters introduced briefly, and everyone here is you know, a very down to earth but very twisted and gritty version of these popular children's sort of characters. And you know, it's like I say, it's a double-edged sword. It's an interesting take, but I do think it really is not really a Peter Pan movie at all, to be honest. I mean, there's hints of supernatural stuff, but it's very ambiguous. It's almost like, is this guy, does he have some type of supernatural power? You see at one point him kind of levitate, as Peter Pan in the stories can fly. But is that just in his head? Because then someone comes into his room and he's just on the floor. So is it in his mind that he's levitating? The movie's not really clear. I think deliberately so, but again, it might be a little frustrating. And he kind of sees like shadows on the wall that are presumably telling him what to do. And again, is that just his psychosis, or is there some type of supernatural element at play here? The movie never really sort of says. So, you know, it's an interesting idea for a movie. I actually think it would have hit harder had it had no connection to Peter Pan, or just have him a killer who has been inspired by Peter Pan. And, you know, he finds Wendy and that's the name from the book. I'll be obsessed with this person, or something like that. But as it stands at the moment, it really stands as a sort of like an odd choice to some degree. That being said, the film that we've got, I think, is pretty well done in regards to its production and kind of like its hard-hitting nature. I do think it does succeed in that respect. So I will give this one an above average score, to be honest with you. Although it's not a film I'd ever probably want to watch again. I think it makes for an interesting one-time watch if you don't mind a very dark subject matter, which really only pays lip service to the source material. 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.